Okay, so we're going to kick off here. I think as I noted, this will be the last review for the remaining material for the final exam. You're going to have your assignments. The last day should be Monday for you to submit your assignments. We have material posted for practice. Let me see if I can share here. Okay, so you can see part 3, learning objectives, actually covers quite a bit of material, like goes all the way through your spreadsheets, goes into the limits of computing, social implications. So it covers quite a bit of stuff there. So I'm going to try to cover at least the spreadsheets and maybe cover some of the last part here. But the other stuff is recorded on video anyway, so you can always pick up on that if I don't get it for today. So let me flip over to a spreadsheet here. Just share the whole screen. All right, so we have the spreadsheet. We have a couple of different things going on here. I'll just point out a couple of things. So here we've got this little table set up with employees covering their names, their city, the building that they're in, the employee type, length of service, and the rank. Then I kind of did some stuff over here and some stuff over here, so I'll walk you through all of these. So they're covering different functions that was on your learning objectives. So here, this basically just picks the max for the number here. This range here, you can see 13 is the max, so that's why you get that. You can see this bottom little right here where I can drag that along. That basically helps you with copy and pasting your formula. And you're over here. And note over here, you see the dollar sign. If you remember, we had this idea of absolute and relative references. So you want to kind of pay attention to that. You know that when you do the dollar sign to make it an absolute reference, you can hold on the column and on the row. So that's why you see $2 signs here for your H2, let's say, right? H2 is over here. So by putting a dollar in front of the H, you're locking the column. Putting a dollar in front of the 2, you're locking the row. Okay, so if I were to copy and paste that, you're going to still keep this absolute reference. It's not going to automatically shift. Okay, so we have min here. Okay, this is it's a blank, but we'll be the same thing. So if I had just taken this here, so you can see what happened, right? So I copy and paste it over here because I had the absolute reference. It kept the H. So actually I have to go in here and I have to change this to G. Yeah, similar, you have the average, you have the rounding, right? So you have the average here. Usually that turns out to be some number of decimal places out. So then I wrapped it with this round function. So you have to round and then you set it to 0 decimal. So that's how you can get these whole numbers here. Okay. And then you have the median function, right? So you just apply the median to here and just like how you typically do a median. Here you have to count, and then you have to count A. Okay, so I kind of set up these multiple columns here just so you can kind of get a feel on different things. So you have the count of here, and then you have this count of here, which is fine. These are all numbers. But notice when I come over to here, I do this count, you see it comes out to be 0. Okay, so that's kind of to distinguish between count A and just the regular count. So you can see count A over here. Same thing over here, but then when you get over here, then you have the count of 8. Okay, so if you're asked to distinguish between the count and count A, this is the difference here with the type of stuff that you're counting. Okay, so on the count if, so I just stuck in something here. So all it is that you have your range that you're looking at, and then what's the criteria. So in this case, I said count if equals to 2, right? So you can see here, there's only 1, 2 here. So that's why this became 1. Over here, you have a criteria of 6. So you see a couple of 6s here, and that's why it became that. And then this is just a count if applied on a string, right? So you can see I'm looking at an employee, you get 3, 4, 5, and that's why you have a 5 here. Okay, so count blank is exactly what that means. I think I mentioned this in prior lecture. If I go here and let's say I do clear contents, well, you can see all this stuff changed, but you can also see the count blank became a 1. Okay, so let me revert that. So I'm going to revert that back, and you're back to this, and you have a number here, right? But now if I go in here and press blank, it still looks like blank. It still looks like it should come up as a blank, but I go into here, and you can still see it's 0, right? So the fact that I put in a space is still going to get picked up here, and that's why it still shows as 0, right? So the only way it really is blank is when you do the clear contents, and that's really empty. Okay, so that's something that kind of catches up a lot of people when you're doing these type of things. Visually, it looks like it should be blank, but it's not really blank. Okay, now over here, you have the concatenation. Right, so of course you have like the regular function within Excel to do concatenation, which basically you can take cells or strings or whatever, separated by commas, and then it'll just concatenate everything together. So in this case, I concatenated London and HA with a dash in between, right? And that's how can you end up with that. But one thing I want to kind of show you is if I go over here, it's the same type of concatenation, but I'm not using the Excel function to do the concatenation. All right, so I'm using these ampersand signs. So same thing, I took the city, I took the dash sign, and then I took the building, and I'm using these ampersands to do the concatenation. Okay. Now the other thing that was in the Excel learning objectives would be the use of and, or, and not. So, well, actually, there's also if statement usage also. So for if statement, basically the argument here, you're gonna check some logical condition here, and based on what happens here, if it's true, you're gonna do this part. If it's false, you're gonna do this part. So there's 3 things that go into the if statement. Okay. So in this case, I'm checking if this value over here is equal to employee. If it's equal to employee, I want to come back with true. If it's not, then I'm going to come back with false. Right? And so that's how come you ended up with false here, because you can see this was a consultant. Okay, and then I just drag this all the way down, and you can see it just lines up all of these different things here. Okay. So now this is where I did the and. So you can see I do the if, and then within the if, where it says the logical test section, which is this first part here, I put an and, right? And within the and, you just put in the different things that you want to and together. So in this case, I want to check if it's a London and check if it's an employee. If they fulfill both conditions, that means it's true. So the and will come back with a true. And then I want the if to print out true. And of course, if this is false, then it'll come back as false here. So in this case, you can see this is London and consultant. So that's why it came back as a false. Down here, you see there's a London and there's an employee, and that became true. Okay. And or works, in a similar way as you would expect, right? So I'm not going to do the or, but I'm going to do the not, right? So the not is basically just flipping the values here. So you have, this test, if the employee equals to employee, or actually I should say if the type equals to employee, then I'm going to say not, right? So essentially what I'm saying is if not employee, then I want to be true, and then else it will be false. Okay, so you can see that's exactly what happens here. You can see this is a consultant, which is not an employee, and that's why it came true. Okay, so that's the usage for a not here. Okay. Another thing I want to go through, which was like in part of the first lecture for Excel, was basically different types of charts. So you'll see kind of some similar patterns. And when you go to like the insert, you can see it says recommended charts, right? And you'll see data in a certain way, and it'll try to say, well, okay, if I see data this way, I should do a histogram. If I see data this way, it should be like a line chart. If I see things in a certain way, it's going to be like a pie chart. Okay, so you want to try to remember those different types of criteria. Okay, so if I look at this data here, it's just like a series, right? Time series, you can look at it. So it's like January 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th, right? And then in this case, you're showing values, let's say, for some stocks. And then you have different values here. So this is one of the standard types of patterns for data. And so whenever Excel sees something like this, and it asks for a recommendation, when you ask for a recommendation for the type of chart, you'll usually get something like this. And so it lines up. You can see automatically it'll have the dates here, the values over here, and you can see the key here for like IBM and Apple. Okay, so all of that is kind of done automatically. It's just helpful for you to know when you see something like this, what type of chart usually is the recommended view on this data, right? So you see something like this, generally you're going to be looking at this line chart here. Okay. Similarly, if you come over to here, you can see up here you got a category, you got these different groups here, and you got some value attributed to it, right? So whenever you see something like this, Excel, the chart, recommended charts is going to come back something like this, like a histogram, right? So you can see ABC, and then you can see some numbers over here to match up over to here. Right? So again, this is another type of pattern that you might see when you see data like this. It'll fall into essentially a histogram or a bar chart. Okay. The other part here you can see is the pie chart. Right. So the notable thing about the pie chart, generally you're looking to do something like this to fit it up to 100. Right. You fit it up to 100. You have a location, and you have these different categories of location. You do the recommendation, and it's going to come back and say you should do a pie chart. And so you can see on the key here all of the different locations. The overall bit is location, and then you can see the pie charts here. And you remember you can also set up, you can play around with all kinds of different formats, which really you're not going to have to do on the exam, but it's just as a FYI. The important part, what I just kind of showed you, is what you want to remember here. Okay. So you can play around with different things here. Again, like I don't really think you're gonna do too much with this. It's just nice to know you can play around with different things on the chart. You can flip the axis and whatnot. Here, I go here. So, okay. See here. Let me go over to here. Probably something else that would be important for Excel sheets, which I think I've done a couple of times, but let me do it one more time, is like around the VLOOKUPs. So if you look at the major functions for Excel, the most commonly used things would be something like this, where you have a table of stuff and you're going to do all kinds of filtering. Or you can do like different types of totals here. Remember, on the totals, let's say I do this filter like this. I take out this consultant. You can see all of this stayed the same, right? Because it's still looking at the whole thing. And you remember when I did probably a couple exams, a couple lectures ago, if you want to be able to do filters and have that translate into these things, either you look at the totals that's associated with the table, or you use the concept of subtotal. So you use subtotal, right? So subtotal, any of the subtotal stuff that you use from there, you're going to adjust the calculations. So you can see all these guys here. If I calculate the average, um, let's actually do that. So let me do the count. And let's just do the count of this guy here. All right, so that's fine. So that's 8. Same thing when I do the count over here. You can see 8 over here. So now let me change this. And you can see that changed to 5. Right, but you can see the count over here still stayed at 8. Right, so that's another thing you want to pay attention to. I think usually when people do this type of stuff in practice, this is the type of things that they kind of get caught up on. They see things visually in Excel and they expect certain results, but it doesn't come out that way for certain reasons, right? And this is one of those reasons. So certain types of functions is going to just look at the table regardless of whether you see it on the screen or not, or look at the data regardless of whether you see it on the screen or not. So if I filter things out, then you have to be careful and either use the functions associated with the table, or you use things like subtotal. Okay, so that's something to pay attention and watch out for. So let me try to set up something again to demonstrate VLOOKUP. So like I was saying before, the different things you look at Excel, you have like big tables, you do all kinds of filtering and various functions off of that. We did it, we've done stuff in terms of like the financial formulas, the payment calculators and whatnot. You also have things like VLOOKUP and pivot tables. So those are the major categories of things that you should have a pretty comfortable handle on with respect to Excel. So let me do a VLOOKUP. Just let me type in a few things here. Okay, so I've done the VLOOKUP. So I'll walk you through. So what I'm looking for is 1. So that's my lookup. And then this is the table, which is F60 to G63. So F60 is this one here, G63 is here. So when you specify the range, remember this is what you do with the colon in between. And then which column am I looking for? I'm looking for the second column, which is this column, and then false. So I think I've mentioned this a few times, but you want to pay attention to the false. If you don't put anything in there, you're going to default for approximate match. Okay, and what approximate match versus exact match means is this. So right now I have it as 1, which I get an exact match, 1 to 10 here. But let's say if I change this to 2, of course it doesn't find anything, right? Because I have 1 and then I have 3. So it doesn't find anything. So that's what's meant by exact match, right? But now, if I change this, now it works, right? So same thing, I'm still looking for 2, but now by changing this to be true, I'm going into approximate match. So when I do approximate match, the way it works is I look here, all right, that's not a match. I go to here, it's also not a match, but it's also bigger than my key, right? So my key that I was looking for was 2. So it didn't find it here, and it didn't find it here. But by the time it hit here, it recognizes that it's bigger than the key that I'm looking at, right? So of course, this implies that this has to be sorted, right? So when you're doing this, you can't have the numbers out of order. And because of that, it knows this is bigger, so it'll come back down to 1 and then take this value out, right? So that's what it means by approximate. So just to demonstrate one more thing here, let me say I change this to 9. So you can see 9 is beyond the range of this table. So it went outside the range of this table, and then it knows to go back to here and get this value here, right? So that's why it became 40. So this is just some behavior you have to try to make sure you understand and remember. Again, this is one of those things that happens a lot with VLOOKUPs. The references get broken, or you have a difference between exact or approximate match. And in one of my earlier lectures, I also put in the example where you do like the if error, right? So you remember if I have this to be false, you get this, NA, right? Which in Excel is flagged as an error. So you have something like this equals if error, and you want to look at that. So if I trap in, I get NA, which would be an error here. Then you want to say something like, you know, this VLOOKUP key is not found, something like that. So that's something that it doesn't get listed in the learning objectives, but I think this is kind of good practice when you're doing with VLOOKUPs. It helps you to debug this better or easier. Okay, so that's VLOOKUPs. Let me see here. Trying to see if this is something. Let me. Oops, not that. Okay. So this is like a pivot table. Do by city, and let's do length of service. And you remember for this, when you drag something over here, the default is to do the sum. So I think maybe for each city, I'm gonna look at the employees there and look at maybe the average length of service, right? So if I'm looking at all the employees for a city, to count up the sum or the total number of years of service probably doesn't add that much value. So probably looking at the average might be a good thing to look at. Maybe looking at the maximum or looking at the minimum. In this case, let's just select average. So here we've got this lined up. You can do like any of these locations, and for the employees, the average length of service here. And here I can click, I can take out or add locations, let's say. Okay. So yeah, you can play around with different groupings here if you want. You can add more groupings if you choose, take them out. So you just kind of drag and drop into these different things here. Filters, yeah, you can do the filters thing here. It's kind of redundant, but let's say I put the city here, like that. So you kind of have like the two cities like this. And then, let's see here. Okay. So you don't actually display it to here. So probably you want to make it more useful by putting it to here. And maybe let me put the building into your filter here. And let me put New York back in here. So, okay. So we'll put all this back in, and then you have that. Okay, so it's just different things you can drag and drop into these different areas to play around. See here. So similar type of thing, you remember the same thing from here. You have a category, you have some different groupings here and the value associated with it. So you see something similar here, and then you end up with this bar chart or histogram. Okay. All right. So let's see here. Try to come back here, see if I got most of the stuff with the spreadsheet. Yeah, relative, absolute, formatting. You can do all kinds of formatting. Quickly, if you're looking at a sheet and you want to see a whole bunch of like formulas and whatnot, you can just hit the Control tilde, and then you can see all of the formulas like so. Okay. Let's see what else we have here. So you got max, min, average, round, median, that's fine. Absolute and relative reference. You have your different counts. You have the if statement, and or not. Oh yeah, primary and secondary sorting. So let me come back to here, turn the formulas back. So in this case, I actually already put in the sort here, but let me just come back in here and to do the sort. Okay, so all this is just sorting a couple of different things, right? In this case, you have the sort by the last name, and then within the last name, you're going to sort the first name. So you have here, all of this is your last name, that got sorted. Over here, we got two people with the same last name, and then their first name got sorted. All right, so it's just basically multiple levels of sorting. In terms of your primary and your secondary. And this with respect to Excel. If you're talking about primary and secondary key with respect to like databases and other things outside of Excel, it's a little bit of a different meaning. So for the purpose of Excel, primary and secondary is referring to this primary secondary sorting. Oops. Here. And yeah, you can see you can keep on adding more. If I had enough data, I can just keep on sorting. Let's say you had a whole bunch of like, first name and last name is the same, then you might want to add something else to sort on and whatnot. Usually, I think you go one or two levels of sorting, but it depends on what type of data you have. Okay. Yeah, so create your charts here. So you have these bar charts, column charts, I guess they're calling it, pie charts, line graphs, and yeah, explain the circumstances to use the different types of charts. Okay. You see all these links for different topics here related to Excel. Okay. Try and see if there's anything on the vocabulary here that stands out. Okay. No, I mean, I think that looks all pretty standard. Yeah, you can see here it says primary key, secondary key. This is in the context of sorting, right? So if someone just tells you primary, secondary key without saying this type of thing, what they're referring to, Excel doesn't actually have a concept of a primary and secondary key. It kind of does some simulation of it from what you would expect it to be from a database standpoint. But for the purpose of this course, this is in the context of sorting, which is what I kind of showed you here. Let me see here. Okay. Yeah, I kind of look at like things like mod and power and the PMT. It's just like any of these other functions that we've kind of demonstrated here. So I don't think there's too much value to kind of go over that. If you know how to use the function, then you just use the function. Right? So you just kind of know all these different functions. As I noted here before with subtotal, this is one of the key differences you want to remember was the subtotal with respect to filtering your values and how it gets affected by that versus like your normal average and min, max, stuff like that, your count. So subtotal, auto filtering, that's fine. We got the filtering here. Got some repeats on this relative and absolute cell references. display the formula. That was the control tilde. Insert rows, columns, whatever. Like that's pretty straightforward, but I can show it to you pretty quickly. So you're here. Oops, let's just flip this back to here, and so you can do insert. Yeah, I can do a delete. I don't want to do that. Break all my stuff here. Then you can go over here. You can do insert, whatever, clear column. You know, the usual stuff, right? Copy, paste. You can hide the row and whatnot. Yeah, so that should be that. Let me see here. Copying worksheets. You got your functions. All right, VLOOKUP. Okay, so all of these different things, it's basically all these different things, but with criteria on it, right? So you have the sum if, average if, count if, right? So it all works the same thing. The only thing is just you're doing it with certain types of criteria. So you remember we did some criteria saying like, oh, if it's greater than 5 or something like that, not equal to some value, right? So it's just an additional criteria on top of the range that you're selecting. So we're gonna keep on going that type of stuff we covered in the other lecture already. Okay, pivot table. I just did the undo for the Excel table. That's fine. Filter sorting, pivot table. Okay, so in the interest of time, I want to just go through quickly on the social implications. And I mean, I guess it was like just the last lecture in terms of the limits of computation and privacy and security. But let me see. So I'm just going to come back to here. So limits of computation, just kind of understand the Turing test. That's kind of mentioned a lot, both in the book and we also cover it in the lecture. And going from Deep Blue to Watson to AlphaGo, and what's the significance of those 3 different things with respect to artificial intelligence. Universality principle, talking about how computers, they actually can do what the other computers can do. So it's just gonna maybe take longer to do one in one computer versus another, but the basic computations and capabilities would be the same. The amount of work and relate to speed of the program. These NP complete program problems. You know, the most common example is talking about things like the traveling salesman problem. So game tree, you remember the game tree started off with something like the chess programming, where you kind of listed all these different options or trees and all the paths that you can take. So at the beginning, it was kind of like it was kind of like brute force, right? So how much computing power you could take to look at all the possible game trees at what level, whatever level, could be 5 steps ahead, 6 steps ahead, 7 steps ahead. And then you kind of over time refined it a little bit. So that's why you got into things like parallel computation. So you can evaluate these in parallel. And there was different types of tricks or things relative to AI in terms of pruning the tree. So you're not actually looking at all of the different paths on the tree. So you start off with the brute force, looking at all the different types of trees. Now you start doing things in parallel, and then you start doing things at looking at smarter ways to evaluate without looking at all of the different trees. Then you remember you go from Deep Blue to things like Watson or AlphaGo, where AlphaGo you didn't actually give it anything, right? You let it figure out. You gave it some rules, but then you let it play itself over many iterations to figure out what's the ideal gameplay to win at AlphaGo, right? Versus like in the old days with chess, people basically were programming specifically all of the different types of moves. So they got like different patterns, like famous chess moves, or programming the different game trees for them to evaluate. So that's kind of the significant differences from the later iterations of something like AlphaGo versus like the initial stuff with chess with Deep Blue. You guys know what a chatbot is. We covered that. NP complete, interacting problem, the halting problem, right? You remember like the halting problem would be something like me trying to debug, me trying to program a computer to do debugging. Certain logical things which may become an infinite loop would be very difficult for a computer to figure out in terms of debugging. Okay. Let's see here. All right, so under social implications of IT, you had some idea of different aspects of privacy, different treatment of that from, let's say, the European Union versus, let's say, the United States. And talked about like some different options with respect to privacy, the ownership of privacy. And then you talked about encryption, right? The basic encryption, public and private key encryption. See here. We had this thing that was a notable thing in terms of the right to be forgotten. And I think it wasn't really, trying to think, was that covered in the book or not, in terms of like the Google interaction with this right to be forgotten. So Google had the lawsuit with the European Union to kind of say, if you had the right to be forgotten, is it applying only to the European Union, or is it all over the world? So Google won the right to only apply it to European Union, but outside the European Union, it didn't necessarily apply. And I think there were some numbers there talking about, how many people actually asked for this right to be forgotten. And I think there was some number, I forgot what it was, like maybe 40% or something pretty big, in terms of like individuals that wanted to get their information taken down, private information taken down. All right, so you remember the Fourth Amendment. Fourth Amendment was mostly geared towards like the government having access to your data, or basically the right to not be like stopped on the street and searched for no good reason and stuff like that. And just remember, there was one aspect of that where that doesn't really apply to private companies. This was geared towards the government. So that's why you have these other things talking about how to deal with just everybody in general, whether it's the government or private enterprise with regard to access to your data. Okay. All right, so social networking, we had some examples of social networking, things like crowdfunding, um, things that maybe it was available in the past, but it was more um, uh, a wider audience, given like what's available on the internet. So, we talked about things like microfinancing, like I said, various fundraising campaigns where maybe before you had to go through a bank to get financing. So now you have, sort of things like this where you have peer-to-peer lending or fundraising at a lower level. So it kind of opens up more options there. Um, it was also talking about things like electronic payments, um, how that's kind of evolving given like what's available on the internet. Um, and then there was some aspects about talking about securing your passwords. So best practice on securing your passwords. Um, 3 examples of crowdsourcing. Yeah. Um, there was also aspects about getting ideas. I don't think it's in your vocabulary, but this idea of gamification. So they had different things where they had like the NASA projects where people are helping them to tag information, like on the pictures and stuff. Um, you had things like, people helping to see how proteins are folding. They kind of set up as like a game, and people are competing against each other. They got like little badges when they got to certain levels. Um, so yeah, GoFundMe was an option in terms of crowdsourcing to raise money for a cause. So yeah, it should be fairly straightforward to come up with examples of crowdsourcing and explain what that means. Okay. All right, so we have a few minutes left. So I'm gonna stop sharing here. Let me come back to the chat here. Okay, so let me see what kind of questions we have here. We got a few here. Yeah, so you don't have any more lectures after today, but you have recitations still. Let's see here. Okay. Oh, okay. So conditional formatting. Um, so conditional formatting, all that means is, I don't know if you remember from the lecture, you would have something like, if something is greater than whatever, make this color red or something, right? So it's just to set colors or do some formatting based on some criteria. So that's kind of the reason why you do conditional formatting. So you'll see like in some fancy Excel spreadsheets, they'll have all kinds of like different colors, bolding and highlights or whatever. So for conditional formatting, you're going to be just using certain criteria. It could be like you want to highlight some outliers. You want to highlight like a number that's way too big or like a big negative number or something like that, and just make it red or whatever color you want to make it. So that's generally why you use conditional formatting. But there's other reasons why you want to, you know, make things look a certain way, either bolded or color wise. Okay. This spreadsheet that I'm playing around with, yeah, I mean, I can save it and put it up into my lectures area. And you can use it as sort of like examples to look at, which is fine, right? I mean, you guys probably want to set up your own example spreadsheet so you can like crank through this pretty quickly on the exam. Um, like I said, there's like a couple of like little gotchas on the spreadsheet you want to be careful with. Similar to what I mentioned in the last lecture in terms of the JavaScript, where you want to be careful in terms of like assignment and comparison operators. You know, with the Excel spreadsheet, there's things like the subtotal versus like the regular functions, or the VLOOKUPs, the true versus false on the exact matching. So I kind of mentioned those a few times just because those are very common errors and common issues. And you can imagine on the exam, we might put something out there to try to see if you can, you know, catch like the common errors there. Okay, so yeah, I'll put the spreadsheet up there for reference. Okay. Um, yeah, I don't know if you remember. I guess you can do like naming, right? Either as a cell or as a range, right? So you can highlight things. Let's say that table that I was showing before, if I want to name that table range to be like employees or something like that, you might remember that I don't have to say the range. Let's say A1 colon like G8 or something like that. I can just say, let's say I call the name of the range employees. Then I would refer to that. They're both the same thing, right? And so you remember that for some people looking at the documentation on something, let's say they look at some formulas or whatever, they might look at like a self-reference like A1 and say, okay, what does that mean? Versus you call that cell range to be like employee or something like that. So it's easier to understand and follow, and maybe it's even easier for you to refer to it because maybe you make a really complex sheet and you don't remember like the cell number, or you don't remember the range. So then you can just refer to it by that name. Okay, so that's what like a named range or a named cell would look like, and how you would use it. Okay. Uh, any other questions that I can answer? Yes. So Kickstarter would be an example of crowdsourcing, right? So anything where you're just trying to engage a wide population of people for a cause to do something, right? So it could be to solve a problem, it could be to raise money, it could just be to, you know, champion a cause, like maybe, you know, something politically, you know, environmentally, whatever, right? There's all those type of things to just engage like a wide audience. That platform is available with things like what we're looking at with technology right now, as opposed to in the past. You know, you might have different channels to engage like a wide population of people. Okay. All right. Well, if there's no more questions, I'm always available on email. So feel free to send me email. You know, I thank you for all of your support for this semester. I wish you luck for the final exam. Um, and you know, all the best. And just keep me in the loop if you have any questions, and I can help out anyway. Okay. All right. So thank you and have a good night.